Welcome to Introduction to Applied Behavior Analysis. Let's begin by explaining what applied behavior analysis is. It is the science in which tactics derived from the principles of behavior are applied systematically to improve socially significant behavior, and experimentation is used to identify the variables responsible for behavior change. There are some important concepts here in this definition. First, let's discuss applied. This term refers to the fact that interventions and procedures used in ABA deal with problems of demonstrated social importance. We do not target or address behaviors just to see what would happen. There is a purpose, and that purpose is in helping the individual and/or society. Next, let's talk about the term behavior. Behavior refers to anything and everything an organism does. We focus on behaviors that can be clearly defined, observed, and measured. Now, analysis. This is perhaps one of the most important components of ABA, as it what makes this a science and not a handful of tricks or assumptions. We carefully observe, measure, and track variables in order to identify relationships between the environment, which is anything outside or inside the organism, and the behavior of the organism. The history of ABA. Behavioral psychology has a long and complex history, so we will only touch upon a few of the more important milestones. One of our first demonstrations of experimental control over the behavior of an organism was seen in the experiments of Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov is often credited with being the founder of respondent conditioning, sometimes referred to as classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov was a scientist investigating digestion. His experiments involved dogs. He used precise experimental methods and found that a reflexive response, salivation, could be conditioned or learned and occur in response to a previously neutral stimulus. He did this by pairing the sound of a bell with the delivery of food. After numerous pairings, the bell was able to elicit the dog's drooling behavior. John Watson extended the respondent conditioning findings to human behavior in his infamous Little Albert experiment. An experiment such as this would never be conducted in modern practice due to serious ethical violations. Nonetheless, these experiments showed us that respondent conditioning can and does occur in the human species. Briefly, as we'll discuss later, the experiment involved an infant, Albert. A white rat was presented, and Albert showed no fear response, just curiosity. Then the experimenters paired the presentation of the rat with a loud, unexpected noise, which causes a startle response, crying, fear, etc. After multiple pairing, the white rat was presented alone, no noise, and Albert showed the same fear responses as if the loud noise had occurred. Albert had learned to fear the rat. B.F. Skinner is perhaps the most important scientist in behavior analysis. Through Skinner's work, he was able to demonstrate that not only through respondent conditioning did we learn, but more importantly, through the consequences of our behavior, through operant conditioning. His focus was on observable behavior, behavior that scientists were able to specifically define and measure, not hypothetical constructs that were often seen in psychology at the time, like ego and attitudes. Throughout this course, we will learn about a variety of behavioral principles and strategies. We will discuss these within the context of how you can use a behavioral perspective to change your own behaviors through the process of self-management. Self-management in a behavioral perspective means applying the principles of behavior to change or modify one's own behavior. The list below covers just a few of the principles of behavior and behavior change strategies that have been studied by behavioral researchers. We will discuss each of these in greater detail throughout the course. Let's start off by a discussion of respondent conditioning in more detail. As mentioned earlier, the experiments conducted by Pavlov demonstrated that reflexive behaviors could be learned. Respondent conditioning is learning that occurs when a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, and now has the power to elicit the same response. Some examples of this would be when an infant who has received shots at the doctor's office begins to cry at the sight of the doctor. An unconditioned stimulus is an event that automatically produces a specific response. For Pavlov's dogs, it was a presentation of food. Food does not need to be learned to produce an effect in an organism. The stimulus is the thing present in the environment. An unconditioned response is the behavior that the organism engages in response to the stimulus. For Pavlov's dogs, it was the salivation that occurred once the food was presented. It is easiest to think of these in terms of reflex types behaviors. I blow a puff of air, unconditioned stimulus, in your eyes, and you blink, an unconditioned response. You tickle the palm of a newborn infant, an unconditioned stimulus, and the baby will grasp, unconditioned response. You see a delicious meal, unconditioned stimulus, and you salivate, unconditioned response. A conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral thing that had been associated with an unconditioned stimulus. This is learned. For Pavlov's dogs, this would have been the bell that was paired with the presentation of the food. The conditioned response is the same response as the unconditioned response, but it is now elicited by the presence of the conditioned stimulus. For Pavlov's dogs, this would be the salivation that occurred now at the presentation of just the bell. The bell now elicits or causes the salivation. If we think about it in terms of human behavior, we can see how this often occurs with young children at the doctor or the dentist. A child would not have an inborn fear of the doctor or of needles, but as those stimuli are consistently paired with the pain of a shot, the doctor and or the needle become conditioned stimuli that elicit or cause the emotional response that used to only be elicited by the shot itself. This diagram demonstrates the process of respondent conditioning as seen in Pavlov's investigation. The food, the unconditioned stimulus, is presented and elicits the unconditioned response, salivation. The sound is presented, neutral stimulus, and no response is elicited, no salivation. After several pairings of the food, unconditioned stimulus, and the sound, which was previously neutral, now elicits the salivation response, which is now called a conditioned response. Operant conditioning is the learning process by which behavior is changed by the consequences of that behavior. Unlike respondent conditioning, which is learned solely through stimuli that occur before the response, operant conditioning requires a response to occur. Consequences in this context refer only to a stimulus or stimulus change that occurs immediately after the behavior and affect the future rates of the behavior. These include reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. Reinforcement is anything that occurs after a behavior that increases the probability of the behavior occurring again. Oftentimes, people think that reinforcement refers to only rewards or good things, but it is really important to understand that anything could be a reinforcer. The only way we really know if it is a reinforcer or not is if the behavior it followed increases. This is why sometimes yelling at a child so that they stop talking out in class doesn't work. The yelling might actually be a reinforcer for that child. If the behavior increases, we can say that yelling was reinforcing. We will talk about reinforcement in more depth later in this course. Punishment, on the other hand, is anything that occurs after a behavior that then decreases the probability of the behavior will occur again in the future. Again, just as in reinforcement, people often think that anything we typically see as bad or unpleasant is a punisher. It is again important to understand that anything can be a punisher, and the only way we really know if it is a punisher is if the behavior that it followed decreases in the future. Here are a couple examples. A student is in math class and is acting defiant. He is put in timeout. He continues to act defiant each class. Timeout is not a punisher, even though most people would consider timeout to be a clear punishment. Another example would be a student raises their hand in class and is called on. The teacher gives lots and lots of praise for answering the question. The student no longer raises their hand in class. What do you think happened here? The teacher probably thought that he was reinforcing the student because praise is generally seen as a good thing. However, the hand-raising behavior decreased, so for this student, praise acted as a punisher. Antecedents are cues in the environment that precede and set the occasion for your behavior. We learn what these cues are throughout our life through respondent and operant conditioning. Think back to the baby at the doctor's office. The sight of a needle is an antecedent stimuli. It cues the fear response. Or perhaps think of students in a classroom and the substitute teacher walks in. The substitute teacher is an antecedent stimuli. She cues the students that some behaviors may be okay to try out today. The way we commonly describe the process of operant conditioning is through the three-term contingency. The three-term contingency consists of the antecedent, the response, or behavior, and the consequence, A, B, C. For a really simple example, we can turn to how we train our dogs. We tell the dog to sit, an antecedent. The dog sits, the behavior, and we give them a treat, a consequence. If the treat is reinforcing, which it most certainly is for most dogs, after we do this a few times, the dog will learn to sit after we say sit. Finally, it is worth taking a moment to discuss what behavior is. Behavior is anything an organism says or does. It can be overt, meaning directly observable and measurable by others, or it can be covert, meaning something internal, like thoughts. For most behavior analysts, we focus on the overt, the observable, and the measurable behaviors.